Hi, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you're all well and enjoying the podcast. As always, I welcome any thoughts, suggestions, and feedback you have to make the podcast better, and, of course, any suggestions you have for guests you'd like to see. I wanted to share with you a new way to participate in the Whiskey Ring Podcast Bottle Share Club. There are several people who have reached out to me about being put on a waiting list for the top tier. After much thought, I've decided to open that tier up to more people. If you have been hesitating, or if you are a current supporter wanting to level up, reach out to me at david@whiskyinmyweddingring.com or through social media or Patreon, and I'll be happy to help you move up. I also wanted to send a special thanks to my current $25 a month patrons, who have agreed not only to this change, but who have been truly irreplaceable supporters of this and who make this podcast happen. Thank you to all of you in no particular order. I'm talking to you, Ken, Jesse, Jim, Bill, Don, and John, Yana, Connor, Zach, Scott, Ollie, Steve, and Jake. Without your support, this podcast wouldn't be happening anymore. And thank you for helping me to keep the lights on and keep guests coming to you every week. As always, you could support the podcast for as little as $1 a month, with ad-free episodes starting at $5 a month. This support is the reason the lights stay on, and to make sure the podcast and website are the best they can be. Thank you to all who are already patrons, and I hope to have more listeners join soon. Visit patreon.com/whiskyinmyweddingring to join today. Without further ado, here's a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Hey folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we're going back over to England, and we are visiting one of the most beautiful spots that I've ever been to. I think my guests will agree, the Cotswolds, to visit the Cotswolds Distillery. With me, I have on founder and CEO, Daniel Szor. Welcome on.
Great to be here, David. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I realized as soon as I said it, you're still CEO, correct?
Well, I'm not.
Oh,
Now I'm just, I'm founder and whatever executive chairman makes me, but basically, yeah.
Fair enough. I think you had said you transitioned out of the role, but that's pretty okay. We'll ask you plenty of questions about that too. So thank you for coming on. So as I was just mentioning before starting recording, Dan's done a great job of getting the Cotswold name out there. It's a name that I've been aware of through festivals, through events. Got to meet Dan last month at a Drammers event. Shout out to Charlie. And as such, we won't be talking too much in this podcast about the kind of quote unquote origin story as you would normally hear it. We'll reference different points and such, but I will definitely encourage people to listen to some of Dan's other interviews and podcast appearances that I'll include in the links, as always, for my research on the episode. This one's going to focus a little more bigger picture view. So my first question for you, Dan, is that in reading your book, Spirit Guide, one of the things that comes across immediately, I think as early as chapter 2, was that art has played quite a large part in your life and that of your parents. You tell a heartbreaking story of how art quite literally saved your father's life in Poland. And for you as yourself, art was very much a part of your life as a consumer appreciator in cities like New York City, Paris, and London. And you've recently named a line of whiskey after the Arts and Crafts movement in the Cotswolds, another artistic movement. Have you always been drawn to art?
Well, it's a very interesting way to kick off. And it makes me ask myself, really, to what extent I am. I'm certainly not artistically talented. I'm inclined, I suppose. I love art, and I had two parents who actually met in art school back in Poland, and were both very artistic. And my father also quite literary, a really good writer. I had no talent at all, which I don't know, was a bit of a disappointment given yeah, how wonderful. I mean, my mother in retirement became an incredibly prolific painter. I was an appreciator, and that was sort of drilled in from an early age. But I suppose a lot of what has driven me with the Cotswolds, which is searching for things that are real and things that can really elicit a passion, did come from things that my parents instilled in me. I think definitely a love of nature. And that's what brought me out to the Cotswolds. And I think the love of sort of traditional craft probably also to a great extent. Um, so yeah, I think that probably it did very much come from my parents.
And you've said otherwise. You have a great appreciation for people who make things. So I have a question about that that'll circle back later on. So I promise that will come back around.
Sure.
Um, with one more question regarding your parents' influence on you, which again just flowed off of the pages in your book. I wanted to quote one part about work ethic. So you say, quote, being a second generation immigrant, as well as a Jew and an only child, certainly seasons the way you perceive the world and how you seek approval. As a rabbi friend once described my city career, you work on Wall Street, but you're still a shoemaker in a shtetl, end quote. You've been open about how this kind of line of thinking, this need to, I've got to work. I don't necessarily enjoy it, but I've got to work and get things done. I'm curious when you first had that thought about starting a distillery, how that mindset jived or didn't jive with the idea of, oh, maybe a distillery might be in the making.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I don't suppose it would have jived had it not been for the previous career and the amount of time. I guess you could say I kind of felt that after 30 years, I'd put in my time and I'd paid my dues in terms of what my parents, or particularly my father, I think would have wanted from me. I think my mother was actually thrilled with this new adventure and this new sort of quest. It meant a lot to her, and this was sort of in her last years. I think my father was still, despite having done relatively well, I suppose, in my career and financially, he was still very nervous about the whole venture. He wasn't wrong. It is a very scary thing, and it still, has yet to really create the sort of, profitability that a lot of businesses would have done by now. But it is an extreme. I mean, the twin challenges of making whiskey and creating a sort of consumer brand in a new category from a standing start are long-term things. But I think, yeah, very much. When you're the child of an immigrant, it just does very much. I was having a chat about this with a guy I met just yesterday who was born in Germany of Sri Lankan parents, and when your parents basically put all their money and all their effort into moving somewhere with probably very little to create a better life, the child definitely grows up with there's definitely a feeling of overt or not, from your parents of we gave up this and this to give you a better life. You have advantages, you have opportunities that we never had, and we want to see you use those, and so that I definitely did grow up with that, and that probably had a lot to do with being sort of sliding into Wall Street in the 80s, after college, not feeling a particular passion for having any other particular calling, and that ended up because of having found myself with a startup company after about 4 years of working at banks, that grew quite a bit, and I sort of came in on the ground floor. It ended up being a nearly 30-year career.
And I'm curious now that you've, by all accounts, including your own, found something that you really do love to do. Been doing it for a little over a decade now, in a place that you love. Um, do you ever have moments of, I guess, either self-reflection or looking back where you still kind of feel like the shoemaker in the shuttle, or is that a bygone thing for you now?
No, I completely still feel that way. And I feel that way because ultimately I realize that that's kind of the way that you probably are going to feel if you try and scale something, and your ambitions are you have high ambitions, and you have to work very hard. So I think that romantic notion of the craftsman, um, it is pretty romantic, and there are things that to this day I marvel at how how meaningful they are in terms of creating something which gives pleasure to people, creating something which creates hopefully a legacy, which excites people. None of those three things had anything to do with what I did for 30 years. It didn't particularly give pleasure to people. It didn't really get people excited, and it didn't create any sort of legacy. So on that score, I'm definitely ahead and I'm in line with what I thought I was getting into. But in terms of the sort of the shoemaker comment, which sort of goes to sort of hard work and you don't get to sort of stop, it never ends kind of thing. That's probably, I think, something that I'm still experiencing because our ambition, as far as we've come in 9 years, our ambition and actually our financial need is to get even further, really. So that drives us to, I think it drives everybody to work very hard all the time.
And I should amend the question a bit just to say then, if you do find yourself as a shoemaker in the shuttle sometimes, do you at least get to enjoy it a little more?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, well, first of all, one of the big things that's happened in the past year or two, you alluded to sort of my no longer trying to be the CEO. We now have a great CEO, Jeremy Parsons, who joined the firm 2 years ago now, with a whole lot more experience in the spirits business than I ever had. So he's been in the business for 30 years, and as someone who's a very good manager. And I, don't necessarily think I'm the best manager, and I've always been very open with that. It's just not a skill that I've ever really had or felt that I could develop. I think I'm a pretty good visionary. I think I have good ideas, long-term ideas, and I get very passionate about them, and I don't typically see them through very well. I don't have a lot of patience. So I think what's really important in a company, and if you're starting a company, is to find people to first of all know what the roles are. And we were once told that every good company has to have a visionary and an integrator. So an integrator that basically brings it all together, as the word implies, and kind of create, delivers the business plan, delivers the P&L. And I was trying to be both. I was trying to, in effect, sit in two seats. And I think what's important is having realized that and now being able to concentrate on the things that I feel that I do relatively well. And that has to do with the look and feel and the taste really of our products, and the what our company is about, the long-term sort of direction. But the day-to-day management now is being run in a much better way, I think, by our whole management team under Jeremy, and that does free me up. So I suppose I'm still the shoemaker, but I get a few days off here and there, which is great.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So there, you've already said a couple things that we're going to bring up later in the episode, but I want just to start as we talk about the Cotswolds Distillery and the path forward. Now, there have been many inflection points for you, and I suppose in some ways there are for all of us. But I guess as an outsider reading the book, listening to interviews, it sounded like yours were particularly stark inflection points sometimes. One of them being for example, the rafting incident that happened, and then, of course, your wife Katya's illness, and many different inflection points in between. One thing that kept coming up as a topic or a theme was that I get the feeling you never quite felt comfortable in New York City. Like you're from the city, as we discussed, which I wasn't quite expecting. I don't know why, but but yeah, when you said that, and when I met you, and then after reading your book, I just got this feeling that he's a city guy, but there's something about it that doesn't quite match with him. And I'm curious if you ever felt that, if you felt it the whole time, or if did something happen that made you feel less comfortable in the city?
Well, I think what happened is that I moved out of the city and I became an expat for 11 years living in Paris. I loved that experience, both because I've always been a Francophile and I always love France and all things French, and kind of really it was realizing a dream to live in this beautiful city that I'd always adored. But then when I started going back to the States, I realized that there was something different, and it's what they call reentry shock that a lot of expats get, because you've lived this life which is very different than the folks who you knew back home. You've had to, maybe fight different kind of fights and deal with different sort of challenges. You kind of almost make up your identity every day, and you live in this very alluring, kind of seductive middle zone where you kind of almost feel like you don't. It's with that Groucho joke. You don't want to belong to any club that would have you. Well, you don't have to be part of any club, because in a way you're not part of your host country, but you're not part of the country from which you came. And somebody once said to me, once you cross the ocean and live on the other side, for the rest of your life, you're never going to feel like you're on the right side. And that's kind of the curse of an expat, but it's also um, something which is habit forming, and you tend to love it. So when I went back to New York, I just felt as though everything that I experienced, everything I'd done, almost didn't exist, or just at time, it was like a time machine going back to where I was before all this had happened. And so that's, I think, one issue that I had with New York. And now maybe, I think it's still a little bit that, but it's also just sometimes feeling, I heard somebody once describe going back, living in their hometown, where the town in which they were born was always about being haunted by previous versions of themselves. And I thought that was a good way of putting it too. So it's, I suppose, having moved around quite a bit and lived in France and lived in London, then Paris, and then London, and now in the English countryside, sort of feels sort of like you're always, I guess I do like to feel always like I'm moving forward, and there's a certain amount of reinvention, I guess, that happens. And I do still appreciate New York, but as a lot of New Yorkers who were born there and grew up in the 60s and 70s will tell you, it's not the same New York either. So it's a very different city. On the other hand, I have two, sons in their 20s who live in the city and seem to absolutely love it. And that's the time of my life I really, really enjoyed it. So maybe also it's a time of life thing.
Definitely possible. That honestly, that question was perhaps even more for me than for anything else, just because like I said, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. Wasn't born in the city, but spent so much time there, live there now. I'm always curious to hear other people's stories about either the city itself or their hometowns when, as you said, there's that disconnect. So with that, I want to move into a couple more of those inflection points. And these are, I've turned them the whiskey revelations in my notes, but they're in no particular time order. So the first one I want to go to was kind of in the middle of the journey, which is your barley epiphany. And I've heard you talk about it, and it certainly was an epiphanic moment. It still boggles my mind in some ways that you have this area, the Cotswolds, it's so beautiful. There's so much barley grown there. It's agricultural. It's kind of the antithesis of megalopolis cities. And yet, with so much of that grain and fruit being grown there, that there had been no distillery there before in the area. And I was particularly curious, as you've gone through starting the distillery and having some time now to look back on it, have you found anything more about why there were no distilleries, even illicit perhaps, in the area?
I haven't had the time really to do further research, but back in 2013, when I was sort of fleshing out this idea, I remember, and I don't remember how I actually got in touch with them, but I found these very nice ladies who worked at the Historical Society in a nearby town called Stow-on-the-Wold. So I spoke to these two ladies at the Stow Historical Society, and they said they would be happy to sort of take this up as a project and look in various archives and whatever to see if, at a minimum, anyone had been arrested perhaps for illicit distilling, and they said they found absolutely nothing. And the thing is, as you go around the Cotswolds, you'll find that most villages, or many villages, will have like a sort of street called Maltings Lane, and most villages had a maltings because that's how what you did with your grain, and if you were going to make beer, you malted it. So despite the fact that there was this active culture of brewing, cider making, both which existed in the area. No one, at least that I am aware of or could find, had distilled. Perhaps given, well, I think two things. First of all, obviously, there's legal regulatory issues and whatever, and also typically it's done on a slightly larger scale, and it was in England. I mean, England did have a number of grain whiskey distilleries. But I suppose also one thing the Cotswolds doesn't necessarily have is just lots and lots and lots of water. I mean, it does have water. England, there's water sort of all over, but there's not. It's not known for its sort of rivers and creeks and whatever. So I don't know whether that had anything to do with it. But what I can say is that, I mean, it was known for its agriculture. It was known for grazing, for particularly for sheep, and for wool. The wool trade was what sort of put the Cotswolds economically on the map, but whiskey certainly didn't come into it.
Yes, I was reading the wool trade in particular in medieval England, mid 13th, 14th century was a big, and I mean through the 18th century as well, but that was kind of the high point. I'm a former medievalist, a recovering medievalist, and focused on England.
Okay.
So, yeah, I was more focused on Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex as my studies. So eastern side as opposed to the western side.
Yep.
But yes, when visiting, the Cotswolds would come up quite often in trade documents.
I'd heard actually that Florentine merchants had actually gotten as far as, getting into Gloucestershire. And I don't know whether that's, coming up the Severn estuary. Now there's the canal that takes one as far as Gloucester, actually. So you can get from the sea, from the ocean into the English Channel into Gloucester now with a canal. But in the old days, I suppose it would have just been coming up the estuary, but that there were merchants that came specifically to choose their bales of wool that they would bring back and work in Italy. So a lot of the churches in little Cotswolds towns were called wool churches, and they were built with the money from the wool trade, basically.
It's beautiful. With just taking this one step further, in the distilling history, I guess I unintentionally showed my American distillery bias there in saying that there wasn't any distilling, but you said there was beer and cider making in the area.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so the core of my question went back to this idea that distilling and brewing, they're fundamentally agricultural processes. It comes out of having either a surplus or something gone bad that rots and ferments. And so whenever I think of an area that's agricultural, I automatically jump to distilling. But I skipped maybe there was just a lot of beer. Maybe they just preferred beer and cider in the area instead of what now we would call whiskey. So maybe that was the case.
Well, there was a fair amount of whiskey in the last few hundred years coming from up north, and maybe that just sort of they were able to do it at a scale and at a price that no one deigned to try and match.
This is fair. That's fair. I have more work to do with the tax codes of England, the 1820 of the UK, I should say 1824 and forward, to learn more about that. So with talking about the Cotswolds a little bit more, it's, as I said, it's beautiful. Beautiful really doesn't begin to describe it. It's an area of outstanding natural beauty. As of last year, now called, I think it is called National Park at this point, but their terms have become synonymous from a legal standpoint in England. Basically, beautiful place and protected are the two biggest things. You had a great comparison that you said at the Drammers event and also in the book, which is that you describe it as the Vermont of England. And it's a place where city folk go to get out of the city. It's within a few hours drive, even back 100, 200 years ago, maybe a day or two's drive with horse and buggy from major population centers. And you also brought up this great question in the context of Vermont being close to New York City and Boston, that the tourism industry that is developed there, while celebrating the local products that make it great, may not exist if not for its proximity to those large population centers. So turning that to the Cotswolds, do the Cotswolds rely on a similar dependency?
I think to some extent. I mean, it's the Cotswolds are. I mean, it has to be said, there's some beautiful areas ringing. I mean, the southeast of England, definitely the economic, hub of the country, and London being the heart of that, being ringed by some, beautiful areas. London itself is surrounded by Greenbelt, and then beyond that, you have really nice places like Sussex, West Sussex. You have uh, you know, various home counties, as they call them, and then you move out into Oxfordshire and then Gloucestershire and Warwickshire, which are all parts of the Cotswolds. Uh, would it be what it was without London and, let's say, maybe Birmingham there? From a tourist perspective, possibly not. I mean, maybe people would have gone a little bit further than a few hours to sort of go out and walk and go on walking tours, which is a very popular thing around the Cotswolds. We have a very famous trail, the Cotswold Way, which goes, because Cotswolds is basically 100 miles southwest to northeast, and there's a trail that goes down the main ridge, which is the Cotswolds, called the Cotswold Way, and a lot of people come out and will walk that for a week. But I mean, the kind of, I suppose, if I'm honest, tourism that really struck me was a sort of a slightly upscale aspirational tourism, that you see out there, that you've seen certainly over the last 20, 30 years, uh, where, because you do have people who have weekend homes, or maybe are in semi or full retirement, permanent homes, and sort of go into London every so often because it's easy. It's an hour and a half or 2 hours. You have people who try and create things that are sort of equally aspirational, sort of in terms of pitching the Cotswolds vibe and the English country sort of thing at a pretty high level. One of them, down the road from us, is Lady Bamford, who woman who's married to Lord Bamford, Anthony Bamford, the who runs JCB, which is a very large industrial company that makes, it's like the Caterpillar tractors of the UK. It makes all the yellow diggers, and they have a huge estate nearby, and on which Lady Bamford decided to create a farm shop, but not just any side of the road farm shop, a farm shop that was sort of like a destination farm shop with a cafe, with a restaurant, with a clothing store, with a homeware store, and everything branded really beautifully, very, high end. Um, and seeing the success of that, I sort of felt that, well, that there's definitely a demographic that appeals to, this sort of people who are looking for a premium experience. And now we have a lot more of that nature here in the Cotswolds. A US-based firm, you may have heard of, Restoration Hardware, RH, now has a huge center in the Cotswolds, very high-end. I sort of call it a little bit of a high-end IKEA, but that's just sort of a joke. But Soho House, which was a very trendy members club in London, created their first hotel, just about 20 minutes from the distillery, called Soho Farmhouse. So some people have described this as kind of a holiday camp for hipsters, sort of. It's not exactly sort of real country folk, but it's people who care about things being sort of done in a certain way, and who have a certain aesthetic, a certain expectation of things on the premium side, I suppose, which is something. I mean, we are in the business of creating premium products, so I think that's kind of important. Although the biggest surprise was when we first came out with our first product, which was our gin, and we had a little stand at the nearby Shipston on Stour food fair, which is a pretty local, kind of pretty sort of not very fancy kind of event. I was amazed at running out of gin about every 3 hours and having to run back to the distillery and getting more. And you just wouldn't expect people in, some of the areas around us, and the sort of demographic, to be running around buying 35-pound bottles of gin. But that was because that was a trend that was in the making. It was happening. And it was people, all the things you hear, drinking less but drinking better, premiumizing. That was completely like in the UK was in the throes of that trend, and our timing was good in terms of hitting that. So that helped. So it turned out to not only be, as we describe it, the Dalesford crowd, the people who come out in their Bentleys or whatever in their souped up Range Rovers. Kind of it was folks who were a lot less, but who were interested in things that were kind of different, artisanal, handcrafted, premium.
And I think that does speak in a lot of ways to also how distilling has grown up around the world in the last 2 decades or so. The craft movement across the world, it's been marketed mainly, I think, to a more premium audience. Perhaps, pardon me, building on the craft beer trend that had gone before, and just, yeah, as you said, keep premiumizing. And I think over COVID we saw this as well. It went into hyperdrive where people bought less but better overall. So continuation of that trend. With that, I wanted to go to the second revelation, and again, these are not in time order, but which was your Scotch Malt Whisky Society event at La Maison de Whisky in 2001, I believe, right?
Right.
So I put this together with also your exploration of the world of cognac, only because there's a parallel there. But I'd love to just hear more about that SMWS meetup and what it was like.
My office in Paris was across the street from Hotel Raphael, which one night was hosting or was the venue for a SMWS tasting, where they invite existing and new members and try and get people in. And there was a guy by the name of Alfred, I can't remember his surname now, who was their sort of ambassador in France, who was hosting it. And I don't remember at all how I got the invitation, but I went along after work, and I just had a blast. I was just completely blown away because I hadn't really known very much about I knew nothing about whiskey, really. I mean, next to nothing, and I wasn't a whiskey drinker. I knew a very small amount about maybe a few other spirits. Calvados had spent time in Normandy, and as we mentioned, sort of cognac, etc. But I was completely blown away by what we were drinking, because first of all, just the variety, the fact that we probably tried maybe 10 or so, maybe 10 to 15 different bottles, each one from a different cask, each one from a different distillery for a different region, and they were all fantastic, and each one was different. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, the French, who are so focused on terroir, seem to have kind of missed a trick on this one, that they, didn't figure this out, because what I, as a not particularly knowledgeable consumer of brandy, was exposed to was mainly cognac, maybe a little bit of Armagnac, but I found that taste profile to be extremely samey, extremely homogenous, and not particularly of great interest. I was always kind of drawn to Calvados, and I guess I had from 1997 a little place that my ex and I rented on weekends in Normandy, and it was right in the middle of Calvados country in the Pays d'Auge, and used to love to go around to visit those distilleries. And I just always thought that there was something more kind of there was more heart in that spirit. But yeah, the whiskey thing kind of really did blow me away, and that's when I sort of decided I was a whiskey lover.
What did you drink before that? Or did you drink before that?
I think, well, I mean, I think being in France, it was completely about sort of wine, and I loved, I think probably a lot of the enjoyment of going out and meeting producers and hearing their stories came from doing a lot of that with wine. I mean, sort of every weekend, particularly before I had my first son, and there were like lots of weekends free, and just sort of pile in the car and head out to the Loire Valley, head over to Champagne, head down to Burgundy. I mean, just great experiences, and there is something about winemaking. I would say that it out sort of somebody once said that in terms of the means of production and the science, what the production is about, if you look at brewing, distilling, and winemaking, brewing can be really put down to science, and it can be kind of codified, and it can be replicated if the conditions are right. Distilling is kind of part science and part art, and wine is like all art. It's all kind of black magic. It's all kind of weird things. I think nowadays, I mean, qualities have gone up, and things are able to be a lot more codified, but there's still something, particularly when you go visit small producers in the countryside, like in France, where they've been doing it for hundreds of years, that is very romantic. So I was into my wine, and occasionally I would have a little something after dinner, but that was about it, really.
And just hitting on the Calvados note for a moment, you recommended a Calvados from the Camet brothers from Normandy, which I believe I found the right one. It was Ambrosia. But I did find the brothers. I'm going to definitely get a bottle of that because you were fairly rhapsodic about it. So you sold me on maybe someone else's product as well as your own.
Yeah, well, he's pretty well distributed. His name is Emmanuel Camus, but it's now basically brothers that run it. And Adrien Camus was the father, so they now run it. The father's passed away, and yeah, someone turned me onto it actually while we were in Normandy, and it wasn't one of our local ones from like down the road. It was from far away. It was from like 15 miles away in Pont-l'Evêque, or near Pont-l'Evêque. But somebody said, "Oh, well, this is a Calvados that they drink in the Élysée Palace, which is like the French White House, the presidential palace." And I tried it, and I thought, "Wow, this is really great." But that's as far as I ever. It just became like my go-to Calvados. But then years later, I can't remember quite how I ended up getting to meet Emmanuel Camus, and then going to see him. And I've been to see him 3 or 4 times, and he's been to see us in the Cotswolds, and we've just developed this great kind of love and affinity. And I'm just always blown away by some of the techniques he uses, particularly in terms of maturation. And by the process, because it's really the traditional process. These are wood-fired stills, and fired by little. I mean, part of the art is knowing how thick a stick you put under it to get. I mean, that gets you all these kind of rich flavors, these Maillard reactions and stuff, and in the stills, the caramelization, and yeah, I mean, it's great stuff. And I think the one that I particularly love, I don't know if it's available in the States, is called Rarity, and it's 75 years old. And gosh, it's still really good at 75 years old. So, yeah.
It's beautiful things about some spirit, like it's particularly right now, Armagnac, Calvados, where you can get what I would call hyper aged spirits like that, 50 plus years old, for fairly, either reasonable prices compared to the age or reasonable to find them as well.
Yeah.
And it's kind of nice as whiskey prices keep rising. You have a little bit of release valve for me for Armagnac, but I might go in Calvados as well.
Yeah. I think that I mean, for me, what is so interesting about, let's say, what Emmanuel does is it's about, and tell me if I'm sort of geeking out too much, but I do think it's fabulous. It's just his understanding of wood and spirit and how to age it. For example, we went into one of his little sheds where he's aging, casks of Calvados, and every cask was laid on its side, Dunwich style, had a rectangle like this cut out of the wood around where the bung would normally have been, and covered with a piece of cheesecloth, like a piece of muslin. And we were saying, what gives with this? And he said, well, my angel share is far greater than my sales every year, which is kind of a bizarre thing to hear somebody kind of be proud of. I mean, that's a huge money loser, but
Sure.
He has this belief that what you're looking to do is to flash off kind of as much alcohol as possible and to concentrate the flavors in what's left over, and that oxidation is really key to developing the flavor and the smoothness. And it used to be said with Calvados, oh, don't drink anything less than double digit ages because it'll rot your, it's too hot, to burning, to whatever. And Emmanuel's 6-7 year old Calvadoses are absolutely lovely, but that's just an interesting way of thinking of things. I mean, he takes it to the extreme. His true passion is actually balsamic vinegar made from cider. And that's a crazy thing where you're filling casks like this big and decanting from one to the next every year and reducing and reducing. So it's this idea of kind of a reduction. Think of it as if you're making a stock, I suppose, in your kitchen, and you let it, the longer you let it boil, or if it's a lobster stock or a beef stock or chicken, the more intense that flavor becomes. And that is truly, if I had to say what drives me, and what makes me love spirits, it's intense flavor. Maybe I'm not particularly sophisticated, and there's others who kind of can appreciate things that are, but I sort of feel like I'm drinking this alcohol. It's not necessarily all that good for you. What's the purpose of the alcohol? The purpose of the alcohol is to carry the flavor. Just like the purpose of alcohol when you're in doing perfume is to carry the scent. So the more flavor per unit of alcohol, first of all, the less I'm going to drink, the more I'm going to enjoy it. So that's the dream. That's the goal.
I mean, I could say when at the Drammers event, we tried somewhere between 10 and 12 expressions. It was quite a spread. And I did have certain favorites, I'll admit. But I can easily say not one of those were light on flavor. All of them just, and it had nothing to do with the proof, which I appreciated, the proof being in most cases either cask strength or somewhere in the 50s ABV wise. But beyond that, nothing felt watered down. Nothing felt like it needed injections of flavor or anything like that. It just was what it was, and you could tell. I think in all cases, what kind of cask you were using, at least in a broad sense. Maybe you didn't know you were using Bonyuls necessarily, but you knew it was a sweeter wine cask or a rum cask or something like that. And to have that flavor come through so clearly while also not losing the flavor of an already very flavorful base spirit is quite a feat. I know that's something that you're very proud of in terms of the distillery's character.
Yeah, I am, but I mean, I'll tell you something. This, I don't think I've ever, said this sort of in public before, but I mean, we had a tasting the other day at the distillery, and what I'm trying to do is, I mean, we have a lot of really talented folks who have good noses and good palates, and I'd like to make this increasingly sort of, communal sort of effort, and we have now a bigger sensory panel than we've ever had, and I only have one request of them, which is tough because they all have day jobs, is that I wish we could do it more. Like I wish we could be basically doing 2 big sessions a week or something. But as much fun as it is, it takes a lot of work. I mean, first of all, it basically takes, you got to draw a lot of samples from a lot of casks. In other words, we don't have a full-time blender. Everybody has a day job. And it takes a couple hours of everyone's time. But honestly, I find that there's so much you can learn from those sessions. And that's if there's one thing about this business that's endlessly fascinating, I don't think I could ever get bored with it. It's tasting things. So in the most recent one, we were trying some of our oldest bourbon cask whiskey, and then there's always a question of which cask, but there's also a question of what ABV to put it out at. And I'll be honest with you that there is a trick, of course, that new distillers will, very often tend towards things that are higher ABVs because there's more concentration of flavor with a higher level of alcohol. And if you want a lot of flavor, well, that's one way to get it. But with time, as your stock gets older, you do develop more complexity. I think more develops on the nose, particularly. There was one whiskey which everyone loved, which, for me in the beginning kind of felt not as pungent, sort of, as I kind of typically think of our whiskeys. But everybody, and this includes, we actually have a guest who comes a guest taster who's a guy who's spent his whole life in the spirits business, felt that it was extremely elegant, extremely sort of sophisticated, and it was, I think, like low 50s, maybe even high 40s, which I know sounds, for most people, that's pretty strong, but for us, that's kind of like, getting down there, sort of, particularly on a bourbon cask. But I sort of saw where they were going with it, to say that, sometimes, as you get older, maybe it's not always about, what a big, hairy whiskey you can sort of come up with lots of just loads and loads of flavor. But sometimes things that are more subtle, and maybe it might be more of like an aperitif kind of a whiskey. So there are different directions it can go. But I guess I still will probably just, again, this is personal, and that's why it's important to have a lot of people, because it shouldn't all just be what I like, because what I like is just what I like. But there should be a range of things, and we can have those big flavor monsters, but we also, I think, increasingly will have things that are slightly more sophisticated, more subtle.
And I think I will speak for myself to say I'm very happy with whichever direction you go on that. Having tasted 12 whiskey, I don't get to often taste 12 expressions of any distillery, let alone at once. So it really was wonderful. Um, I got to tell you, I have so many questions. I'm actually having to cull some of them as we go along, just because they're just for time's sake. But I don't know. There's so many questions to ask and so many ways to go here. But I think the best way is to visit the next revelation, or the next inflection point in whiskey for you, which was the Kavalan Vino Barrique.
Mm.
Also another favorite of mine. It's my favorite Kavalan expression. And it brings us to Jim Swan, as well as, for this one, we'll focus on Jim Swan. I know, for myself, I can say, if someone were to ask me, are there people in whiskey that you, alive or dead, that you would love to meet? He's, to me, one of my top three, without a doubt, maybe even top two. And you had the pleasure and fortune to work with him for several years. And as you go, the reason I'm asking this question next is because you talked about how much you need flavor in things. And Jim was such a big proponent of flavor, cask, wood, spirit, everything has to have its own flavor, but it all has to come together. And when you talk about the Kavalan Vino Barrique, one of Jim Swan's greatest hits, you've called it kind of an Armagnac meets a bourbon meets a single malt, all in one. And I would love to know, like, did you ever discuss that particular pour with Jim?
I don't know if I put it in that way. I certainly, I think, based on my experience with the Vigno Barrique, and that experience came before I even knew how Vigno Barrique was made, that it was made using these casks, and these casks were called SCRs, and what that process was of basically turning a wine cask into a whiskey cask, a bourbon cask, kind of. And that was the idea that of a certain Jim Swan, who I would ultimately work with. None of this, it wasn't the case. It goes back to 2014, I think it was, but like early 2014, and I had just broken ground on the renovations of the distillery, and some really good old French friends, who weren't into whiskey, had actually won at a school auction, a high school sort of charity auction, a private tasting, evening long private tasting at the Maison de Whisky's flagship whiskey shop in the 8th arrondissement in Paris. And they called me up, and they said, "What are you doing in a couple of weeks?" And I said, "Well, I've got to be in Switzerland or something on business." And they said, "Well, we've got this evening, and we thought it'd be perfect for you. We're allowed to bring as many friends as we want, but we can't think of anybody but you." And that was really sweet. So I actually stopped in Paris overnight on the way back, and I went off with them. And this is the shop, the Maison de Whisky shop, that used to have a sort of a tasting club, a whiskey lovers club, that was basically managed by a guy by the name of Jean-Marc Bellier, who basically has run that shop in the 8th arrondissement of Paris for, I think it's coming up on 30 years. And I think he retires this year, which is going to be a great loss. Um, and Anyway, I hadn't seen Jean-Marc in well over 10 years, I guess. And I show up with my friends, and I don't think maybe he did remember me, I'm not sure. But I basically told him, I said, you had quite an influence on me because of those early days at the club. I became this whiskey geek, and now I'm actually building a whiskey distillery. And he was like, oh, man, that's wonderful. And there was this Mr. Miyagi-like kind of this sort of little twinkle in his eyes, and he was great. He was a great guy. He has made that shop really. And he said, well, in your honor, I'm going to choose a bunch of whiskeys for us to taste tonight that all have to do with New World whiskey, because you're going to be making New World whiskey, and one of them was that Vigneault Barrique. But when I tasted it, I mean, having just said earlier that I love big flavors, that was a big flavor. And not only was it a big flavor, it was a big flavor out of a 4-year-old whiskey made in Taiwan, which meant that it was disruptive, and I was going to be disruptive because I was making whiskey in a place that had never been made before. So that's why I fell in love with it, I think. And then, when the whole story came out, we started working with Jim. And I told all this to him, and I said, I really want to go big on these STRs. And for Jim, I think STRs were a bit of a sort of a specialty cask, kind of. They were also a helper cask. He described it as a cask that he gave to a lot of whiskey makers that came to him 2 years in with whiskey they didn't feel they were happy with, and yet needed economically to release a whiskey at 3 years old. Mm-hmm. And for him, 1 year in an STR, re-racked into an STR, would really improve the quality of whiskey. It did. But I said, well, I actually I want 50% of our wood to be STRs. And he was like, really? You sure about that? And I said, yeah, absolutely. Because I love it. And so that's kind of where, how it all happened, really.
And you're right. I mean, the STR, it's one of the reasons I would have loved to talk to Jim. It's such a disruptive cask in and of itself. It's been given to so many distillers around the world that Jim worked with, and some with whom he didn't work, who have kind of adopted it rather because it works so well. And yet, if you taste an STR cask, even partially from Cotswolds, from Cavalon, from M&H in Israel, so they're totally different flavors that you're getting. So the cask itself is sure giving plenty of flavor, but that flavor, even in and of itself, can enhance the flavor of the spirit underneath, which still, I mean, for all these different distilleries that he worked on, still each one has its own flavor as well.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, I rather crudely could maybe break whiskey down into two big taste profiles. I don't know if this, I've been thinking about this lately. I'm not sure it's a fully formed thought, but it does kind of, I think, have some resonance, which is that you can describe whiskey as being either beery or winey. If you know what I mean. Beery being it's more on the grain, it's more about the grain, and winey being it's more about the fruit. I would say that I would say there's probably a lot more if you poll both existing whiskey lovers, but also people who aren't sure, who are on the cusp, who think they might like whiskey or they want to. Actually, our global whiskey brand ambassador, Rob Patchett, has a podcast called I Want to Like Whiskey, which is was a great name for it. And there's a lot of people who are like that. But if you give them those two flavors, my assertion is more of them will like a winey whiskey than a beery whiskey. And certainly that's always been my case. I still remember the very first single malt whiskey I ever had in my whole life. It was 1993, which made me 31 at the time. Actually, not the first whiskey because I'd grained, I poured myself the odd little blended whiskey from my parents' bar when I was growing up, or whatever, the Chivas or the Cutty Sark. But the first single malt was when I was in London for a couple of weeks in, I think it was like November of 92, actually. So I would have been just turned 30. And I was at this hotel, and it was like that typical London where it was cold, it was raining. And I was sitting in this hotel, and it was just so British, and there was a fireplace. There was a nice little bar. called the Pelham Hotel, and I thought, I'm going to have a whiskey because that's what I should be doing here in foggy old cold London. And I remember hearing about or reading about some single malt called Macallan, that Sherry made whiskeys really good. And I had a Macallan, and it was really good. And that was kind of me saying, I actually enjoy whiskey. Who knew? And I think a lot of people are surprised when they finally have a whiskey that they like. I like whiskey. That's cool. But that was, I mean, you could sort of say that a sherry cask whiskey probably is on the winey side, isn't it? Or a whiskey where the distillate, and this is the taste profile I think a lot of new distilleries these days are going for obvious reasons. They are going for a fruity spirit. Jim Swan was all about creating a fruity spirit. So I think there's also something to be said in terms of a fruity spirit, that there's an evocation. It evokes a little bit sort of wine and things winey, whereas there's something about the more grain forward kind of spirit and maybe more of a bourbon cask spirit. I mean, if there's big flavors, you're getting honey and vanilla and all those things that you always hear about. But I also sometimes in whiskeys, which I feel disappoint, sometimes, if I could say that, I find that they kind of remind me a little bit of sort of, there's a beeriness about them. And I like beer, but I'm just not, it's a different flavor. So anyway, that was again why the STR thing. I felt that, and then that comment about sort of Armagnac and single malt is that there's, in our case, I think it's the fruity spirit, and it's also the fact that it's a wine cask. So there is some wininess to it, which I particularly like.
It's I mean, it's worth noting the one of the other revelations that I'm skipping over just again for time's sake was your visits around the U.S. to craft distilleries, and that was where you said, as you said, there were some that had fantastic stories or fantastical stories sometimes uh, that you'd walk through, but then the whiskey itself just was okay, or sometimes outright disappointed. It just didn't match up. Was the big thing, and um, when I think when people, at least in my experience, when people are getting into whiskey and they start to try more craft distilleries and younger whiskeys, I hear you on the beery versus winey side, because I think people tend to use this term young. We'll call something young or a little raw. And that question of what does young mean as it's usually the next question. You know, it tastes young. Well, is it raw? Is it too grainy? Is it this? I know for American whiskey, at least, we've identified a couple of things. So previous guest and friend of the podcast, Lisa Roper Wicker, she identified, burnt corn oil can be a note that people associate with craft because they're distilling on too high of a heat. So the corn is burning, the corn oils are burning. And then others who will say, no, I want the grain to be front and center. I want you to know what strain of rye we're using, or strain of corn even, or wheat. And I think there's room for both of them, but there is a middle ground where they haven't quite figured it out sometimes, where I get yeasty flavors, almost like it tastes like a very high proof mash. And that's when I'm usually thinking, okay, this isn't quite ready yet. Because you can have a grain forward whiskey that doesn't taste like raw grain or mash. But as soon as I get something yeasty, that's immediately for me. All right, this then I have to evaluate, is this something that can be saved, just needs more time, or is this just start fresh?
Yeah. And the other thing too, for me, what's really important and what defines a good spirit is balance. And having that right balance between the wood and the distillate. And people say, oh well, this spirit, this tastes of new make, or this tastes of this is too new, or whatever. Well, if your new make is great, well then there's nothing wrong with, actually. I mean, you to me, I think generally you want a whiskey where it's pretty clear as to what the distillate is and what it's about, and that it's not completely hidden. The other thing I found with a lot of when I was going around the States, because you don't have the 3-year focus, you did have a lot of people throwing whiskey into very small casks, and you would get overwooded, and then it just felt wrong. It just felt like there was distillate, there was wood, there was nothing holding them together. But I'll mention one that I remember it heartened me. By the way, at that time, I didn't even know yet what we would be distilling on, because I didn't think I had either the money or the time to wait for stills from Forsyth, which was kind of my dream, because they were just cool people who made amazing stills. And I thought, I'm going to have to go with a German still, because that's what a lot of craft distillers were doing at the time. They're buying their stills from Carl and from Holstein and from a couple of other places. And by the way, Holstein are great. Well, they're all great stills. We have a couple of Holsteins that we use for gin, but we've used for other things as well. But I had never had a whiskey made on a Holstein still that I liked. And I thought, well, I mean, surely it shouldn't make it. I mean, that it can't make that much of a difference. I mean, it can make a difference, but I mean, just because one is maybe thicker copper, or is it the shape? And I was very happy to found one American whiskey that I particularly loved, that was made on a Holstein still, and it was made in San Francisco, or I guess Berkeley is more accurate, St. George's.
Oh, yes.
And I think, interestingly, I think there is a European sensibility there, particularly all the fruit brandies and whatnot, and this appreciation of balance. I think, and it felt to me to be a balanced and very drinkable whiskey. So I was happy to have found that, because I thought, okay, well, if I've, at least now I know you can make a whiskey. I can make a whiskey that I like, and I only had one way of judging. This was just a whiskey that I liked. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but you think to yourself, it's my life savings, so I might as well, make something that I feel proud of. And if other people don't like it, I never felt that I had a weird, obscure kind of palate. I always thought I had a pretty basic palate, and that if I liked it, other people would like it. So that made me very happy. But yeah, I mean, there were a lot of them that just were. And I spent a lot of time in the first couple of years being part of the whole ADI scene in the US, the American Distilling Institute. They did some great conferences once a year that would put you, in a conference center for 3 days with 1,000 people like you, who are living through what you were living through, as I remember one keynote speaker said, so you've rated your own 401k. Then you rated your wife's 401k, and now you're basically wondering whether you're ever going to, and so that was really nice to feel part of a community that understood one another. But not all the whiskeys necessarily were to my palate. But again, an American palate and maybe a European palate, those are two different things.
And certainly St. George's being really one of the pioneers of American craft distilling. I kind of put them with St. George's, Germain Robin, Clear Creek. These are the earliest of the early, and there is something, you're right, European about really all of them.
Yeah. Well, I used to love my Karate Kid moments at the distillery, which is, again, getting an old guy with a young guy and having this kind of amazing knowledge transfer. And so, Jim Swan was the ultimate sort of Mr. Miyagi kind of, but also Emmanuel Camus, who we were just talking about, the Calvados maker, came over, and the guys absolutely loved working with him. And one of the names you just mentioned, Hubert Germain Robin, I met at one of the ADI meetings, and he's the guy who started Germain Robin, well, obviously, the namesake. And Hubert came over and spent a week with our guys. And that's when I was dead set on making apple brandy, making, as I was going to call it, Cotswolds. So here's this amazing 10th generation cognac distiller with these guys who are brand new, teaching them, amazing techniques. And that was so much fun. That was really a part of, there are things that I will always look back on that just give me a lot of pride and joy, even if from an economic point of view, it went nowhere, but they were part of our journey, I suppose.
Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whisky Ring podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps, or email me at david@whiskymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whisky My Wedding Ring or at Whisky Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whisky Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whisky My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whisky Ringers group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.